Hi everyone, welcome to the December 12th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski as we look back at this weekend in racing that featured some stakes events at Oaklawn, Gulfstream, a graded stakes at Los Alamitos, and then one big figure that we'll discuss from Aqueduct. But the schedule is pretty light this week, as you would expect in the middle of December. A lot of the top barns not sending out their best horses at the moment as we gear up for the coming new year, but still some interesting races to discuss. A few 2-year-olds in action that we'll probably see when they turn 3 in a few weeks in some stakes races. So some interesting races to talk about on the podcast today, Craig, but figures to be a pretty short one.
Yeah, I will never complain about that. I've got plenty to do this time of year, but yeah, this is the one time a year kind of between Breeders' Cup and Malibu Day where things slow down a bit. But as you said, there were still some good performances and some 2-year-olds that ran some nice races.
Let's kick things off at Oaklawn, where we were for the TimeformUS forecast last week. And wow, Craig, that proved to be a really difficult sequence. The first leg worked out okay with Tejano Twist. I know neither of us were in love with him, but obviously he was a horse that you had to use. But after that, just a few improbable results. I know that we mentioned one of the 20-1 winners, but the other two alongside were a little difficult to come up with, or I should say a couple 20-1 winners, and then I think a $20 winner, the stakes race later in the day. Among those stakes races, we're only going to talk about the Ring the Bell, which of course was won by Tejano Twist, and another impressive effort from a horse that's just really fun to watch, making that big run from far off the pace, and then he really drew away from this field in the stretch, proving much the best.
He was. I think our concern on the forecast was he wouldn't have any pace to close into, and that's been something he's encountered in many of his races, but it didn't prove to be the case on Saturday. It's a race where we don't have any of the fractions coded in red, but the early one just missed as Top Gunner and Rivet went out in near 140 type pace figures, and it really set it up for him. And I don't want to take anything away from Tejano Twist. He ran great. I really like the ability he has to get into the race on the turn. He's not one of those closers who, when he's on his game, has to wait and kind of just plods up there. He really exploded, and it was pretty obvious he was going to win as they were approaching the quarter pole.
Yeah, really all Chris Landeros had to do was find a seam as he tried to save a little bit of ground coming around the far turn, but once he popped out into the clear at the top of the stretch, he was not going to be stopped. And I think the other story of this race, Craig, was that there just was not a whole lot of running going on behind him. The horse that you would have expected to challenge Tejano Twist, Rivet, just ran one of his bad efforts, and this horse has become pretty unreliable. He definitely has quite a bit of ability when he feels like showing up, but he's just been so up and down this year, and this was obviously one of his poorer efforts. And then some others, just maybe the trips didn't work out, they didn't run their races, so definitely cleared the way for Tejano Twist to put in the dominant performance that he did.
Yeah, he was probably much the best on paper. I think we both knew that. It was just a case where we thought maybe the pace would be tough. Didn't work out that way. Maybe Rivet, they'll try to revert to those off the pace tactics that he showed at Mahoning Valley, which were accidental, but he ran much better that day than he did. He kind of got caught between horses in the speed duel, so not a great place to be in, but he was well beaten. Necker Island, who ran second, he's a speed figure maker's dream. He kind of just runs about the same race every single time out. Just kind of plotted his way into second when everybody else fell away.
Yeah, and no sour grapes for me because he was never beating the winner, but Osborne really should have been second in this race. I don't know what the plan was with him. I mean, I guess the inside post is going to be difficult for a horse like that, but I mean, he was saving ground and just basically there was no urgency shown with him coming around the far turn, allowed to drop even further back than it seems in the chart call. And then he suddenly came back for sixth once he was finally, came back for fourth, I should say, when he was finally asked for some run in the late stages. Just a kind of a weird race for him, stopping and then starting again. But obviously, he and nobody else was going to get close to the winner on this day. Let's go back to Friday's opening day card at Oaklawn, and the feature race that day was the Advent for the 3-year-olds going 5.5 furlongs. And when I first watched this race, Craig, I kind of expected the Valentine Candy was going to get a huge figure because it looked like a visually impressive performance as he just always traveled strongly coming around the far turn and put this field away pretty impressively in upper stretch. But there probably wasn't too much running going on in behind him. And when I looked at this day and the relative times, I kind of understand why it's not a jump off the page kind of number.
Yeah, I mean, I was a little surprised by it too. I mean, when I watched it visually, I thought it would be bigger, but they ran a ton of sprints on the day. I guess the one concern would be that it's the only 5.5 furlong race, and sometimes those live in their own little world. But when you look at the other horses in behind, the figures make sense. So I'm not going to worry about this one too much. And Valentine Candy, he's a horse who kind of has a little rivet in him, though. Is It seems like every other race he runs a good figure and doesn't quite deliver in between. So not sure what's happening there. We'll just have to see how he does going forward. The 5.5 seems odd. He seems like a horse who would maybe appreciate a little more distance in that.
And I don't think we mentioned it. Valentine Candy got a 105 Timeform US speed figure for this race, which is about right in line with his better performances from earlier in the season, including when he broke his maiden on debut in that loaded race at Saratoga. And he's run up to that level now a couple of times, but as you said, he's been a little bit up and down in a few races. They primarily sprinted him. We'll see if they eventually want to try longer. It didn't work out in the hopeful, but that was going to be a tough race for him given the pace situation anyway. So they probably will try some longer spots in the future, but he definitely does feel like one that can do pretty well in these sprint races throughout the winter at Oaklawn. And then one more race to discuss from the Oaklawn Friday card. That was a first time starter that won the fifth race on the day, a 2-year-old going 6 furlongs. Texas Town for the Chris Hartman barn just busted out of the gate, got to the lead pretty easily, and then was just able to hold on late over a very green Crushed It, who took all the money for the Brad Cox barn and probably should have won this race if he had been able to run in a straight line, but his greenness allowed Texas Town to get to the wire first.
It did. This was actually one of the few horses I bet that won this weekend, Texas Town. I liked what I saw from him. I liked some of his workouts, but when I would have to say I was pretty lucky to cash because I think Crushed It, the 10 horse, was the better horse. I better get the figure out of the way because I think I forgot to mention Tejano Twist got a 117 as well. Texas Town ran a very nice 102, but as you noted, I think Crushed It is the horse you want to have your eye on going forward.
Yeah, and these horses probably are more sprint types. I would say, especially Texas Town. He's a son of Speightstown, who we did unfortunately just lose in the last week, and I mean, so much can be said about what a great sire Speightstown was, just the epitome of versatility in a stallion. I think you know, Craig, I'm doing some work on pedigrees and trying to do some updates to our Timeform US pedigree ratings, and was looking into some different sire stats for various stallions, and it's just kind of amazing how the statistics of Speightstown are so even across the board from surface, distance. So I'm sure he's going to have a couple more crops of some nice horses, and Texas Town appears to be one of them, but it's really sprint on the dam side. His second dam, Tar Heel Mom, was a $800,000 winner, primarily dirt sprints. Crushed It has a little more route pedigree. His dam was a stakes winning router on the dirt. Also, I think stakes winner going shorter. So we'll see what these horses ultimately want to do going forward.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Speightstown. I'm almost embarrassed to admit him being the sire was part of why I like this horse. It just seemed like on the day the news came out that it was almost meant to be, and um, not the way I usually bet, but it worked out in this case, and it's a horse I'll be following going forward.
Let's move down to South Florida and talk about some races from Gulfstream Park from this past Saturday. The feature race, well, two feature races on this day, both for the 2-year-olds going 7.5 furlongs on the turf. The male version for the 2-year-olds was the Pulpit Stakes, won by the 6-5 favorite Noted. And definitely some dicey moments for this horse in upper stretch, Craig, because it seemed like he had a ton of run coming around the far turn under Irad Ortiz, but Irad tried to do his bull your way out move at the top of the stretch. It didn't quite work. He got caught in behind horses for a few strides, but this horse's ability was able to bail him out in the final eighth of a mile.
Right, this was my pick in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. That didn't work out. They got him back to turf, and he ran well. He's only going to get a 98 speed figure for the effort. This race was a little slower than the Phillies version. We're going to talk about, I think, next or soon. But I think you don't have to put a whole lot of stock into that figure given the trip he had. I just think he had a lot of trouble in there, and he definitely could have ran at least a few lengths faster. So I like the gameness that he showed. It's pretty early, so I don't want to. The figure doesn't mean a whole lot to me anyway. I would expect this horse to improve quite a bit going forward.
Yeah, these December stakes in Florida tend to come up a little bit on the light side. So I think we'll see some tougher turf horses emerge in this division heading into next year when they turn 3-year-olds. But Noted has already shown ability during his 2-year-old season and definitely ran pretty well here, but didn't have to earn a particularly high speed figure to be the victor. As for those that were in behind, Reminder, who was second at a big price, trying the turf for the first time, obviously moved up on the surface. Palm Tree, who was third, it looked like he had the race won at mid stretch when he kind of forged to the lead between calls as Noted was still extricating himself from some traffic, but he got mowed down by those top two once they were able to get into the clear outside. Let's move on to the other stakes race for the 2-year-olds. This one, the Philly version, the Wait a While in the middle of the card, run as race 6, also going the 7.5 furlong distance. And a similarly close finish at the end here as Ozara just able to hold on over Milliot, the European shipper coming in for Jack Sisterson. And Ozara just got a pretty good trip under Irad Ortiz, Craig. I mean, she stumbled forward a little bit at the start, but it was the kind of stumble that actually got her into position. And from there, just kind of stayed in the two path, got out in upper stretch. For a few strides there, it looked like she was going to stall and maybe wait on horses like she had in a few prior races, but she kind of straightened herself out in the final 16th and was able to hold off that runner-up, who arguably did run the best race.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I misspoke earlier. This race was just a hair slower, 6/100ths than the boys. But she got a 102 time form US speed figure because of pace considerations being built in. I don't have the pace figures in front of me. I don't know if it was a fast or slow situation on the turf, but she ran fine. She's a horse who I think we did a race preview on this one, and we thought maybe the turn back in distance would help her as she seemed to flatten out a little bit late in her last couple races, and it did just that. But I would agree, Milliat was a horse that we both liked in that preview, and she ran fine and was probably the best horse. Just Gulfstream's not really the track where that move is going to work very often.
Yeah, and she was off slowly. I mean, she broke a good length behind the field, as you sometimes see these first time shippers do when they come in from Europe. So she kind of was behind the 8 ball right from the start and traveled into the race pretty well, but just had a little bit too much ground to make up. And probably one that might be able to turn the tables on Ozara in the future as the distances stretch out. And if she's able to break a little more professionally in her subsequent outings. Game effort from the third place finisher, Great Venezuela, first time stretching out, first time on the turf. The pace did come apart a little bit, though, like you said, it's not like they were moving that quickly up front. So she probably was setting a moderate pace and maybe just doesn't want to go quite this far, even though she handled the turf just fine. Let's move on to a couple of non-stakes events on that Saturday card at Gulfstream. The first was an N1X allowance for the 2-year-olds, won by Inveigled. This was race 7 on the day, going a mile, and this horse was a pretty impressive winner for Jane Sabelli. Was coming off a good second place finish in a stakes race to Copper Tax. That was a horse that had run in the Remsen and didn't perform well that day, but a horse who had done very well in some shorter races in the Mid-Atlantic region prior to that. And Inveigled had no problem stretching out to the mile distance here, beating a horse who had attracted a little bit of buzz coming off an impressive Aqueduct maiden win in C Streak, but Inveigled was just much the best on the day.
Yeah, it's much the best. And what impressed me the most with this horse was able to rate in behind horses a little bit. Something he hadn't done in his best races, including when he broke his maiden in that race against Copper Tax. He was right up on the front end. So normally when they stretch out, you think they're going to be up on the front still, but this horse showed in no dimension. And I really think it helped. He ran a very nice speed figure. He's going to get a 106 from TimeformUS, and I would say that he's a horse on the improve and one that we could watch in Florida this winter.
Yeah, definitely a step in the right direction. I mean, a long way to go from now until the Kentucky Derby, so who knows which horses are going to emerge to be factors in these stakes races at Gulfstream as we get to the Derby Trail next year. But a 106 time form US speed figure at this time of the year, not bad at all. Definitely a horse that's moving in the right direction. Kind of an interesting background for this horse. I think he's an Indiana bred by Entice, who relatively new sire who's I think mostly had horses running in Florida as Florida breds, but this one not a Florida bred. The dam side, there's actually some turf pedigree. The dams have to a stakes winner in Europe named Segamia on the turf. So just interesting pedigree notes with Inveigled, but definitely handled the stretch out and distance. So nice job or nice effort from him. As for C Streak, maybe a horse that doesn't want to go quite this far. He was visually impressive in that Aqueduct maiden win just prior to this, but that wasn't a race that came up that fast. That I wonder if that was really a strong field he was beating that day. So probably still some things to prove for that one.
Yeah, for sure. It came up kind of slow. He had some trouble that day and was wide, so maybe that led to the low figure. And he did improve his number here, but he's got a ways to go. And I did want to mention in Vingold, he's a horse who is a gelding, so he's the kind of horse I want to root for going forward.
And you're not alone, Craig, listening to Pete Aiello's call for this race. I think he tried out 4 different pronunciations of this horse's name during the race. It just, every time he called him, we trying something new. And I get it.
Yeah, I think it's inveigled. I think
Yeah,
you had it right.
not the easiest word to say. I think inveigled means like to persuade somebody. So maybe that's coming from the sire Entice. I think it's probably a clever name, though. I didn't look into it that much. Let's move on to one more race from Gulfstream this past Saturday. That was the 10th race on the day, won by Nick Style. Now, this horse, even though she's so lightly raced, is a 3-year-old, debuted well over a year ago as a 2-year-old in May at Gulfstream and was impressive that day, but was put on the shelf for a long time, a year and a half to get back to the races for Ralph Nix. But it was worth the wait, Craig, because she was pretty impressive this past weekend.
She was, and it's one I wasn't sure when I sent the rundown last night on what kind of figure she would get. I kind of guessed at it. If you use the variant for all the other dirt races earlier on the card, it would be much faster than the 108 that we even settled on. But I had predicted right around here, and it's what my assistant came up with as well. With the other horses in the field, it just wouldn't have made as much sense. This race came much later than all the others, so it's certainly possible the track changed. But figure aside, I mean, it was a really impressive race. I mean, she won by over 10 lengths. She didn't even get out of the gate all that cleanly, and it just looked like a paid workout. These were just Florida breds, but she still looks like a horse with a lot of promise. I mean, even that 90 she ran as a 2-year-old, like you mentioned, that came in very early May. So, I mean, that's a really strong figure that time of year. So, I'll be watching this one. I actually have already added her to my stable mail. I mean, it's not like you're going to get a price wherever she shows up, but just a fun kind of filly. I want to see how she develops because she's got that exciting running style of just going fast.
Yeah, and she was just traveling so easily on the lead, and Junior Alvarado barely even had to ask her for run through the stretch as she just drew off pretty much under wraps. This was a really nice effort. Like you said, there wasn't a whole lot behind her. Lopsided victories like this often have a lot to do with the competition, but she definitely took a big step forward during the time away. So Ralph Nix saying after this race that such a big effort off being away for so long, they're going to take their time with her, not rush her right back to the races. But you'd imagine this is the kind of horse that could have a future in stakes company because I mean, we need some new players in that filly and mare sprint division. I think we're going to have some retirements after last year. We'll see if Goodnight Olive really does come back to the races, but always nice to see some new players in these sprint divisions. Let's move out to California and talk about some racing from Los Alamitos, which began their brief winter meet this past weekend. And the feature race there on Saturday was the Grade 2 Starlet Stakes for the 2-year-old fillies. And Bob Baffert has had a stranglehold on this race for a number of years now. I believe this was his 7th consecutive Starlet victory as he sent out the winner here, Nothing Like You. And a horse who isn't exactly breaking the stopwatches, but she's now won 3 in a row, and she obviously handles distance. So in this 2-year-old filly division where nobody's running that fast, I guess you've got to consider her a major player moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been the strongest division. She beat her stablemate in here, who was actually slightly favored over her, but coming in off just the first time out maiden win, but with a much slower figure. I guess people were looking for that typical improvement we see from Bob Baffert horses, but when Grazia didn't really show up at all, the race was pretty much over. She got out to the easy lead and just drew away. This one, I do have the official figure for her. It's going to be a 101. So, right in line with what she's been doing all along.
Yeah, and got a pretty easy trip. Was able to set the pace up front. I mean, they set legitimate fractions for the first couple of splits, and then the entire field kind of dropped away and tired behind her in the stretch, as you'll sometimes see in these dirt routes for the 2-year-olds. Justified disqualification of the runner-up, Greg, when you watch the stretch run. I mean, Great 48, probably a little green and just basically crossed over and completely cut off Chattelis, who was put up to third in this race. But it's not like that horse was ever going to be a challenger to Nothing Like You. The race was basically decided at that point in terms of the win end. She was dominant, and we'll see what she's able to do in some of the 3-year-old stakes races next season. I don't think we'll see her in the Kentucky Oaks unless there's a trainer change, because there's that whole situation still with Bob Baffert and Churchill Downs, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
Oh, I forgot about that it got extended another year. Just one thing that I'm sure we're both tired of talking about.
Yeah, it's. I think there's been enough reporting on similar types of infractions over the past several years, and I think the public is a lot more dialed into this. That once you remove some of your personal biases about certain trainers, you kind of see that this punishment doesn't really fit the crime, even though it was the Kentucky Derby. And I think everyone's just kind of sick of it by this point. So hopefully it can get sorted out. But even if not, let's just hope this is the final year of hearing about this.
Yes, I'm with you.
Let's talk about another Baffert runner while we're at it, Craig. The winner of another race on that Saturday card at Los Alamitos, a maiden race that went as the second on the day, as I'm looking through the chart here. Elwood Blues, a horse that obviously has talent, but we haven't seen too much of on the racetrack since he made his career debut over a year ago as a 2-year-old. He's the horse that was second to Arabian Lion back in October of his 2-year-old season. Saw him once over the summer, then was put away again, came back off another layoff here at Los Al, and finally caught the right field, but ran a fast race, and this is a horse that does have some talent.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would guess he had some issues to keep him away for so long, but this was pretty impressive race. When he first sent this, I just assumed it was a 2-year-old race, but then I remembered who he was in that first race. He wound up with a 113 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort, so certainly impressive. The sprint division hasn't been all that strong out in California. I don't know what the plans are for him regarding distance. He seems like he'd be a really solid sprinter going forward, and if they can keep him on the track, I would expect some improvement off of this one.
Yeah, just hope that this horse can keep it going, because when we've seen him, he's run pretty well. Just every start's been followed by a pretty lengthy layoff. I don't know if this was the strongest field, Craig, and he only won by a length and a half, though he was probably better than that because he got floated out a little bit by a horse at the top of the stretch and then had to straighten himself out and put the rest away. So good effort from this horse, and the runner-up might be okay too. He had run a decent speed figure on debut, but you kind of always want to see these performances at Los Alamitos get repeated elsewhere. So hopefully we get to see this horse at the upcoming Santa Anita winter meet.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. I often say what happens at Los Al many times stays at Los Al. There does seem to be one of those tracks where horses have an affinity for it and often run races that don't really fit the rest of their PPs.
And we'll talk about one more race from Los Al this past weekend. That was a Sunday allowance race won by the 3-year-old Tapatio Leo, and a horse that's been in great form this year. He's now won 4 of his last 5 starts for Peter Miller, a California bred that worked his way through the conditions, now tried open company for the first time in this start, and was a pretty impressive winner. This horse has a ton of early speed, and I would imagine the speed figure, Craig, is partially due to a pace upgrade. I haven't seen the pace figures for this race yet, but this horse really ran off on the front end and was getting leg weary late, but the race was already in the bag at that point.
Yeah, I don't have the official speed figure. I'm guessing it's going to be around a 119, and about a full 6 points of that would be because of how fast he went early. He really was slowing down late. Um, you can see just by looking at the chart, and the margin was not all that much for him, but he won by a length and 3/4. But the Timeform US speed figures are going to be about 11 points apart, and it's just because of how fast he went. Now we don't give a ton of extra credit when horses are so far in front like he is, but it was still enough. It kind of shows how fast he was really going. I'm not sure if that's really the kind of style that's going to serve him well if he steps up in class, but I think he certainly earned the shot, and he would be, at the very worst, a pace factor even against the best sprinters at Santa Anita.
Yeah, and watching this race, the runner-up will be, while he did get pace to close into, maybe a horse that you might want moving forward because he was just unprofessional through the early stages of this race. He's a horse that in prior starts had been much closer to the pace, and when he broke his maiden, he actually did so in gate to wire fashion. And he just seemed like he was really uncomfortable with, I don't know if it was the kickback or being behind horses early, because he was not traveling well, and you could see Joel Rosario try to steer him out into the center of the track before the turn. Once he finally got rolling, he was really flying through the stretch of this race. Nobody else was closing and making up the kind of ground that he was, even though Tapatio Leo was slowing down. This horse was really finishing at the end. Obviously, like I said, got that pace, but a horse that still is figuring things out and we might not have seen the best of yet as another relatively lightly raced 3-year-old.
Yeah, he's a horse who ran a couple 110 pluses the first two starts of his career. Things didn't go well at Santa Anita in his last start. Then they tried stretching him out where he showed high speed. So, yeah, he's a horse who definitely has some upside, in my opinion.
And let's close things out at Aqueduct. A few stakes races this week, but not races that earn particularly high speed figures. We'll just talk about an allowance race from the Sunday card, a 3-year-old that's had plenty of experience, but a horse that just seems to be finding himself at the end of this sophomore season, and that is Quality Chic, who won a 9-furlong allowance race on this card, a horse who was a little bit of a career maiden or had the makings of that when he was with Ken McPeak. Just took a long time to get out of the maiden ranks, claimed by David Jacobson, and just seemed like he found the right field in an off the turf race a few starts ago, and that just got him in the winning spirit. He won an allowance race going the 2 turns on the dirt 2 back. Turf experiment didn't work out, but they got him back on the dirt here, and pretty commanding performance against a decent field of older horses.
It was a good performance. He's going to get a 116 Timeform US speed figure for the race. I did want to note there was a quarter mile that popped up. This was actually at a mile and 3/16, a rare distance there. The quarter mile was wrong. It was like a 24 and change. I've sent that in the Equibase. Who knows if it'll get put in the chart or not. But it was a strong effort for him. The pace was really quick, even though that first quarter was wrong. All the fractions are coded in red. And it's not like he was that far off the pace. He was sitting in 4th in a pretty big field, just a few lengths back. And he made a pretty eye-catching move, particularly when you consider the distance and that it was a sloppy track.
Yeah, sorry, I misspoke there. You're right. A mile and 3/16. So definitely a horse that relishes distance. I mean, watching this race and the allowance race that he won back in early November, I mean, he just travels really strongly in his races and just seems to sustain that pace. He just seems like a real galloper. I don't know if he's the kind of horse that eventually want to think about going even longer than this, being that he's going to turn 4 next year. There are those dirt marathon races that you can try. So definitely a horse that has several options. David Jacobson likes to run his horses over the winter, so this one probably is going to continue to keep a busy schedule, but he seems to have thrived on it so far.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's even a few stakes races. The Queens County comes to mind that are at these longer distances that he may very well be worth taking a shot.
Well, Craig, that wraps up our recap of last week's racing, and this will be our last Pacecast for a little bit. We're not going to do any more of these until January of next year, after the new year. Just taking a couple weeks break from doing these podcasts as the holiday season looms. So the racing, Craig, is going to continue probably in this vein until we get to that Malibu card at Santa Anita after Christmas Day. So we'll be back to recap some of those races probably when we return in the new year. But we're going to take a break from the podcast for a little bit. We'll have one more coming out later this week. That's the forecast. And I think we're probably going to take a look at Oaklawn again.
Yeah, it looks like a strong card at Oaklawn. As for the Pacecast, yeah, we'll be back in January. The racing is really going to slow down coming forward. But as always, I'm sure we'll be talking about it on social media. I'll definitely be posting speed figures, and you can always ask about horses there, as people often do.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening today. And remember that you can catch that TimeformUS Forecast, the final podcast I'll put out in December, coming up later this week on Friday.